The first gunshot struck the fence post beside Harriet Vance's head, sending splinters flying as she dropped to the ground, heart hammering against her ribs. The second tore through the cloudless Wyoming sky of 1876, a violent reminder that the Mitchell gang hadn't forgotten about Frank Cooper's debt or the land they believed should be theirs. Miss Vance. Frank's voice carried across the prairie as he raced toward her on his dappled gray stallion, dust billowing behind him. "Get down!" Harriet had already flattened herself against the dry earth, her cotton dress collecting dirt and burrs as she pressed her cheek to the ground. The thunder of hooves drew closer, both Franks approaching mount and the retreating bandits who delivered their message with lead instead of words. Frank dismounted in a fluid motion, his weathered boots hitting the ground as he crouched beside her, his hand hovering over the revolver at his hip. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, scanned the horizon where three riders disappeared into the distance. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "Just my pride," Harriet answered, brushing dirt from her sleeves as she rose to her knees. At 24, she was no stranger to the dangers of frontier life, but being shot at while inspecting fence lines was a new experience. They weren't aiming to kill, just to frighten. "Well, they succeeded," Frank muttered, offering his hand to help her stand. At 31, his face already carried deep lines carved by sun and hardship, and his once prosperous cattle ranch was now a shadow of its former glory. "I told you working for me was dangerous. You told me you needed help," Harriet countered, accepting his calloused hand, "and I need the wages." Frank's jaw tightened as he surveyed the damage. The fence post they'd spent the morning setting was now split down the middle, rendered useless by a single bullet. "One step forward, 2 steps back. Story of my life these days." Harriet dusted herself off, studying the ruined post. "We'll set another. The day's young yet." Frank's expression softened momentarily, surprise flickering across his features before the hard mask of determination returned. "You don't scare easy, do you, Miss Vance?" "Can't afford to," she replied simply, moving toward the wagon where additional posts and tools waited. "Not since Papa died," Frank nodded, understanding the unspoken. Everyone in Timber Creek knew how Harriet had been left to support her ailing mother and younger sister after her father was trampled in a cattle drive 2 years prior. What they didn't know was how desperately she needed this job at Cooper's Ranch, one of the few that would hire a woman for more than cooking or cleaning. "They'll be back," Frank warned, his voice low as he retrieved his rifle from his saddle. "The Mitchell gang wants this land, and they aim to run me off it one way or another." Harriet lifted a heavy wooden post from the wagon, her muscles straining beneath the weight. "Then we'd best get this fence built before they return, Mr. Cooper." Frank stared at her for a long moment before a reluctant smile tugged at his lips. He took the post from her hands. "I believe you might be the most stubborn woman in Wyoming territory, Miss Vance." "I prefer determined," she countered, a hint of warmth creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to maintain professional distance. As they worked side by side under the relentless sun, setting a new post into the dry earth, neither spoke of the bullet holes or threats. But both knew that more than just a fence was beginning to take shape on the dusty boundary of Cooper's struggling ranch. The first week of Harriet's employment at the Cooper Ranch passed in a blur of physical labor and cautious conversation. Each morning before dawn, she rode the 5 miles from town to the ranch, arriving just as the eastern sky turned pink. Frank always had coffee waiting, strong and black, in the kitchen of his modest ranch house. "Your hands are bleeding," Frank observed on the 8th day as they ate a simple breakfast of biscuits and salt pork. Harriet glanced down at her palms, criss-crossed with angry red welts from handling rope and rough-hewn timber. "They'll toughen up," she said, curling her fingers inward to hide the evidence of her struggle. Frank frowned and disappeared into the next room, returning with a small tin of salve. "My wife used to," he stopped abruptly, a shadow crossing his face. "This helps with the blisters." Harriet knew better than to mention Catherine Cooper, whose grave lay beneath a cottonwood tree on the eastern edge of the property. The town still whispered about how Frank had changed after the fever took her and their infant son 3 years prior. How the once sociable rancher had withdrawn, letting his prosperous cattle operation fall into disrepair as he lost himself in whiskey and grief. "Thank you," Harriet said, accepting the tin. Their fingers brushed and Frank pulled away as if burned. "We've got the south pasture to fence today," he said gruffly, standing to collect their plates. "Mitchell's men have been driving their cattle onto my grazing land. If we can get it enclosed by the end of the week." "We will," Harriet assured him, applying the salve to her raw hands. The ointment smelled of lavender and beeswax, a gentle fragrance that seemed at odds with the harsh landscape outside the window. She wondered if Catherine had made it herself. By midday, they had set 6 new posts along the southern boundary. The work was grueling, digging holes in the hard, packed earth, setting the posts, tamping soil around them, stringing barbed wire from post to post. But there was satisfaction in watching the fence take shape, a tangible barrier against those who sought to take what remained of Frank's livelihood. "You never said why you're so determined to save this place," Harriet ventured as they paused to drink from a canteen of water gone warm in the summer heat. Most men would have sold out to the Mitchells by now. Frank's expression darkened as he surveyed his land, the rolling hills dotted with the small herd he'd managed to keep, the weathered barn in need of repair, the distant glint of the creek that provided precious water. "Catherine loved this place," he said finally. "Said it was where we'd raise our children and grow old together." He fell silent, and Harriet didn't press. Instead, she handed back the canteen and reached for the shovel. "Next post," Frank nodded, gratitude in his eyes for the subject change, "about 20 yards down. We'll follow the creek bend." As they worked, Harriet became aware of Frank watching her, not with the appreciative gaze men sometimes directed at her in town, but with something like wonderment. "What?" she finally asked, self-conscious under his scrutiny. "Most women I know would be fanning themselves on a porch somewhere, not digging post holes in 100-degree heat," he said. "Most women you know probably haven't had to support a family on their own," Harriet replied, driving the shovel into the earth with perhaps more force than necessary. "Luxury isn't an option for some of us." "I didn't mean," Frank began, then stopped. "You're right, I apologize." Harriet paused, surprised by his contrition. Most men in these parts didn't apologize to women, especially not hired help. "Accepted," she said, resuming her work. "Besides, I prefer being outdoors to being shut up in some stuffy house or shop." "Is that why you took this job?" Frank asked. "When half the town thinks I'm one step away from losing everything?" "I took this job because you pay better than the laundry," Harriet said pragmatically. "And because—" She hesitated, unsure how to express what had drawn her to Frank Cooper's advertisement for ranch help. "Because I understand what it means to lose someone and have to keep going anyway." Frank's expression softened. "Your father—" "Yes." Harriet didn't elaborate on how George Vance's death had left them not just grieving but destitute, with creditors at the door and winter approaching. How her mother's health had collapsed under the weight of loss and worry. How her 16-year-old sister Helen still cried at night when she thought no one could hear. They worked in companionable silence until the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. As they loaded tools into the wagon, Frank cleared his throat. "My wife would have liked you," he said quietly. "She valued strength in people." The simple statement warmed Harriet unexpectedly. "I wish I could have known her." "So do I," Frank replied, his voice thick with emotion he quickly mastered. He gestured toward the newly set posts stretching across the landscape. "We make a good team, Miss Vance." "We do at that, Mr. Cooper," Harriet agreed, and something shifted between them, a tentative bridge forming across the chasm of their separate sorrows. The Mitchell gang made their next move under cover of darkness 3 days later. Harriet was awakened before dawn by pounding on the door of the small house she shared with her mother and sister in town. She opened it to find Frank, his face grim in the gray pre-dawn light. "They cut the fence," he said without preamble, "and drove 24 of their longhorns onto my south pasture. They're trampling everything." Harriet grabbed her shawl. "Let me change, I'll come help." Frank shook his head. "It's too dangerous." Mitchell himself was there with his men. "I just came to tell you not to ride out today." "Don't be ridiculous," Harriet said firmly. "Give me 5 minutes." She dressed quickly in the darkness, pulling on her sturdiest dress and boots. Her mother appeared in the doorway of her bedroom as Harriet was braiding her hair. "Another emergency at the Cooper Ranch?" Eleanor Vance asked, her voice weak but her eyes sharp. "The Mitchells are causing trouble again," Harriet explained, securing her braid with a ribbon. "Mr. Cooper needs help." Her mother's gaze was knowing. "Be careful, daughter. That man carries heavy burdens." "I'm just his hired help, Mama," Harriet protested, though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. "Of course you are," her mother replied with a sad smile. "Just remember that healing his ranch won't necessarily heal his heart." The warning followed Harriet as she rode alongside Frank in the brightening dawn. They traveled in tense silence until the ranch came into view, and with it, the damage. The carefully constructed fence lay in pieces, posts split and wire coiled in useless tangles. A herd of unfamiliar cattle grazed on Frank's pasture, their brands clearly visible. "Circle 'em, bastards," Frank muttered, his knuckles white on the reins. "They know I can't afford to lose this grazing land before winter. Can't the sheriff help?" Harriet asked, though she already knew the answer. Sheriff Reynolds was Mitchell's brother-in-law. Frank's bitter laugh confirmed it. "Reynolds suggested I consider selling to Mitchell as a neighborly resolution." They dismounted near the destroyed fence line. Harriet surveyed the damage, mentally calculating the work ahead. "We'll need more posts," she said practically, "and wire." Frank's expression was bleak. "I can't afford more supplies right now, and even if I could, Mitchell will just destroy it again." "Then we'll find another way," Harriet insisted. "What about talking to Judge Whitaker? He owns the largest spread east of here. Surely he'd stand against Mitchell's tactics." "Whitaker's in Cheyenne until spring," Frank said, kicking at a splintered fence post. "By then, Mitchell will have stolen every acre I have left." Harriet watched him, recognizing the familiar slope of defeat in his shoulders, the same posture her father had adopted in the months before his death, when drought and debt had worn him down to nothing. Something fierce rose in her chest. "You're giving up," she said, not as a question but an accusation. Frank's head snapped up, anger flashing in his eyes. "What would you have me do? Fight 10 armed men alone? I've already lost my wife, my son. I won't throw my life away too." "Then we get help," Harriet said, undaunted by his anger. "There are other ranchers who fear Mitchell's expansion. The Johnsons, the Parkers, they've all lost land to him. Together, this isn't your fight," Frank interrupted, his voice harsh. "I hired you to help rebuild fences, not to wage war against the most powerful man in the county." Harriet stepped closer, refusing to be dismissed. "You hired me to help save your ranch. That's exactly what I'm trying to do." They stood facing each other, the tension between them palpable until Frank looked away first. "I can't ask other men to risk their lives for my land," he said, his voice quieter now. "Then don't ask," Harriet replied. "I will." Before Frank could protest further, she mounted her horse and headed toward the Johnson property that bordered Cooper's ranch to the east. She heard Frank calling after her but didn't slow. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Healing his ranch won't necessarily heal his heart. But Harriet was beginning to think the two might be inextricably linked. By nightfall, Harriet had secured promises of help from 3 neighboring families, all small ranchers, who had suffered Mitchell's encroachment. She returned to Cooper's ranch to find Frank sitting on his porch steps, a bottle of whiskey beside him, untouched. "I thought you'd be halfway to drunk by now," Harriet said, dismounting stiffly after hours in the saddle. Frank looked up, surprise evident on his face. "I considered it," he admitted. "But then I thought about what you said, about not giving up." He gestured to the untouched bottle. "Figured I should be clear-headed if we're going to fight back." Something warm bloomed in Harriet's chest at his words. "The Johnsons, Parkers, and Taylors have all agreed to help," she reported, sitting beside him on the steps. "They'll be here at dawn with supplies and men." Frank stared at her in disbelief. "How did you manage that?" "I reminded them that if Mitchell drives you off your land, they'll be next," Harriet explained. "And I might have mentioned that Mrs. Johnson owes my mother a favor for nursing her through pneumonia last winter." A smile, the first genuine one Harriet had seen from him, transformed Frank's face. "You're something else, Harriet Vance." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. "I'm just practical," she said, looking away to hide the color that had risen to her cheeks. "No," Frank said softly. "You're extraordinary." The compliment hung between them, fragile and significant. Harriet stood abruptly, uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. "I should get home. Mama will be worried." Frank rose as well, towering over her in the gathering darkness. "Stay," he said, then quickly added, "for supper, I mean. Least I can do after you spent the day recruiting an army on my behalf." Harriet hesitated, then nodded. "I should let Mama know." "Use my telegraph in town," Frank offered. "Henderson will send your message." They rode into Timber Creek together, the small town quiet as most residents finished their evening meals. A few curious glances followed them down the main street to the telegraph office, where Frank paid for Harriet's message home. The small courtesy touched her deeply. As they exited the telegraph office, a familiar voice called out, "Well, if it ain't Cooper and his lady ranch hand." Harriet tensed at the sight of Bartholomew Mitchell lounging outside the saloon across the street, flanked by two of his men. The cattle baron was in his 50s, with a silver-streaked beard and cold eyes that assessed them like merchandise. "Ignore him," Frank muttered, placing a protective hand on Harriet's elbow. Mitchell wasn't deterred. "Heard you found my cattle on your property this morning, Cooper," he called. "Consider it a fair exchange for the water you've been stealing from my creek." "It's not your creek, Mitchell," Frank replied evenly, though Harriet could feel the tension radiating from him. "The water rights came with my deed." Mitchell laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Deeds change hands, boy, especially when a man can't pay his debts." His gaze shifted to Harriet, becoming appraising in a way that made her skin crawl. "Miss Vance, isn't it? George's girl. Your daddy knew when to cut his losses. Shame his daughter lacks his good sense." Harriet felt Frank stiffen beside her, his hand moving toward his holstered pistol. She gripped his arm. "He's not worth it," she whispered. For a tense moment, she thought Frank might ignore her, but then he exhaled slowly. "Let's go," he agreed, turning away from Mitchell's taunting laughter. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the encounter having cast a pall over the evening. Inside Frank's house, a modest but comfortable dwelling that showed signs of a woman's touch now faded by time, Harriet helped prepare a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and biscuits. As they ate by lamplight, Frank finally spoke. "Mitchell's right about one thing, I am in debt." His expression was grim. "After Catherine died, I didn't manage things well, took out loans I couldn't repay. Mitchell holds the notes now." Harriet set down her fork, understanding dawning. "That's why he's so confident he'll get your land," Frank nodded. "The bank gives me 3 more months before foreclosure. Mitchell's just trying to run me off before then so he can buy it at auction for a fraction of its worth." 3 months, Harriet repeated thoughtfully. "That's enough time to rebuild the herd if we can protect your grazing land." Frank asked, his eyes intent on her face. Harriet didn't look away. "Yes, I told you I need this job, Mr. Cooper." "Frank," he corrected softly. "After today, I think we can dispense with formalities, Harriet." The sound of her name on his lips again sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the hot food before her. "Frank," she agreed, testing the familiarity. Later, as he walked her to her horse for the ride home, Frank paused in the yard, looking up at the star-filled sky. "I haven't fought for anything since Catherine died," he confessed. "It felt pointless." "And now?" Harriet asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank's gaze shifted to her face, his expression unguarded in the silvery moonlight. "Now I think I've found something worth fighting for again." Harriet's heart quickened at his words, at the way his eyes held hers. For a moment she thought he might step closer, but then he cleared his throat and stepped back. "Dawn comes early," he said, his professional manner returning. "We've got fences to rebuild." "Yes," Harriet agreed, ignoring the pang of disappointment. "We do." Dawn indeed arrived early, bringing with it not just the promised neighbors but a renewed sense of purpose. The Johnson, Parker, and Taylor families arrived with wagons loaded with fence posts, wire, and tools. The men brought rifles slung across their backs, and even the women came prepared to work, wearing practical clothing and determined expressions. Frank stood on his porch, visibly overwhelmed by the show of support. Harriet watched from beside the corral as he greeted each family, shaking hands with the men and tipping his hat to the women. When his gaze found hers across the yard, something passed between them, a moment of shared victory that felt intensely private despite the crowd. "Your young lady has quite the persuasive powers," Elias Johnson remarked to Frank within Harriet's hearing. "Haven't seen the community rally like this since the church raising 2 years back." "She's not my," Frank began, then stopped. "Yes, she does." The work proceeded with extraordinary efficiency. With nearly 20 people helping, they not only repaired the damaged fence but extended it further around Frank's vulnerable southern boundary. The women set up an outdoor kitchen, cooking hearty meals to fuel the labor. Children chased Mitchell's cattle back toward their own range while the men built a fence sturdy enough to withstand future incursions. By mid-afternoon, riders appeared on the horizon. Mitchell and 6 of his men, approaching slowly but with obvious intent. The work paused as every hand reached for a weapon. "Stay back," Frank instructed Harriet as he stepped forward with Elias Johnson and the other ranchers to meet the approaching threat. Harriet, naturally, ignored the directive and positioned herself just behind Frank's right shoulder. Mitchell reined in his horse about 20 yards from the work site, his expression thunderous as he surveyed the nearly completed fence and the assembled neighbors. "Well now," he drawled, "isn't this cozy? A community effort to help poor Cooper keep land he can't afford." "Your cattle strayed onto my property," Frank replied calmly. "We're simply ensuring it doesn't happen again." Mitchell's gaze swept over the armed ranchers and their families. "Lot of guns for a simple fencing job. Just being cautious," Elias Johnson interjected. "Dangerous animals about." Some wearing brands, some wearing boots. A tense silence followed the veiled threat. Mitchell's men shifted in their saddles, clearly having expected less opposition. After a long moment, Mitchell's thin lips curved in a humorless smile. "Enjoy your fence-building party, Cooper," he said. "But remember, the bank doesn't care how many friends you have when the notes come due." His cold gaze shifted to Harriet. "Miss Vance, you're keeping interesting company these days. Your poor mother must be concerned." "My mother raised me to stand with good people against bullies," Harriet replied steadily. "She's quite proud." Mitchell's face hardened. He wheeled his horse around without another word, his men following as they rode back toward their own property. "He'll be back," Frank said grimly, watching them retreat. "And we'll be ready," Elias replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "Mitchell's pushed us all around long enough." The work continued with renewed vigor after the confrontation. Everyone understanding that the fence represented more than just a boundary, it was a declaration of defiance against Mitchell's tyranny. By sunset, the project was complete. A sturdy barrier enclosing Frank's best grazing land, protecting the heart of what remained of his once thriving ranch. As their neighbors departed with promises of continued support, Frank stood beside Harriet, watching the last wagon disappear down the road. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "You don't need to," Harriet replied. "This isn't charity, Frank, it's community." "Is that what we are now?" he asked, turning to face her. "A community," something in his tone made Harriet look up at him sharply. His expression was open, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. She hesitated, suddenly uncertain of what they were becoming to each other. "Would you stay for supper again?" Frank asked, filling the silence. "I'd like to show you something after." Curiosity overcame caution, and Harriet nodded. They ate a simple meal in companionable silence, both exhausted from the day's labor yet energized by its success. Afterward, Frank lit a lantern and led her outside, across the yard and past the barn to a grove of cottonwood trees where a small plot was enclosed by a white picket fence, the only fence on the property that had been perfectly maintained. "Catherine and James," Frank said softly, holding the lantern higher to illuminate 2 wooden crosses, one larger than the other. "My wife and son." Harriet remained respectfully silent, understanding the significance of him bringing her to this private place of grief. "I let everything fall apart after losing them," Frank continued, his voice rough with emotion. The ranch, myself, I didn't see the point in fighting anymore, just wanted to drink enough to forget, even for a few hours. He turned to Harriet, the lantern light casting shadows across his face. Until you showed up and started hammering fence posts into my hard-pan soil like you were single-handedly holding back an army. A smile tugged at Harriet's lips despite the solemnity of the moment. Someone had to. Yes, Frank agreed, his gaze intense. Someone did. Someone who understands loss but refuses to be defined by it. Someone who builds instead of breaks. He set the lantern on a nearby stump, its light creating a small circle of warmth in the growing darkness. I don't have much to offer right now, he said, taking a step closer to her. My land's in jeopardy, my herd's too small, and Mitchell still wants me gone. But today, for the first time in 3 years, I believe I might have a future worth planning for. Harriet's breath caught as Frank reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her palm. Because of you, Harriet Vance, you've become my foundation. The word echoed between them, foundation, so perfect in its simplicity, in the way it captured what they had built together, not just fences, but something to stand on, to build upon. Frank, she whispered, his name a question and answer both. He drew her closer, his free hand rising to cup her cheek. Tell me if I'm reading this wrong, he murmured, his face inches from hers. You're not, Harriet assured him, and then his lips were on hers, tentative at first, then with growing certainty. The kiss deepened, and Harriet found herself clinging to his shoulders, her body pressed against the solid warmth of his chest. When they finally parted, both breathing unevenly, Frank rested his forehead against hers. I never expected to feel this way again, he confessed. After Catherine, I thought that part of me was dead. And now, Harriet asked, her hands still resting on his shoulders. Now I'm terrified, he admitted with a soft laugh. Terrified and grateful and more alive than I've been in years. They walked back to the house hand in hand, the lantern light bobbing before them, casting their elongated shadows across the ranch yard. Inside, they talked until the small hours of the morning, not just of Mitchell and the ranch's precarious future, but of themselves. Frank spoke of Catherine without flinching for the first time, sharing stories that made them both laugh through tears. Harriet told him of her father's dreams for their family, dreams that died with him but had shaped her own determination. He would have liked you, Harriet said, curled beside Frank on the worn sofa. Papa always said the measure of a person was how they handled adversity. I handled it poorly for a long time, Frank admitted. But not anymore, Harriet countered, squeezing his hand. Now you're fighting back. Thanks to you, Frank said, bringing her hand to his lips. When Harriet finally rose to leave, knowing her mother would be worried despite the telegraph message, Frank walked her to her horse. I'll come to town tomorrow, he said as he helped her mount. To speak with your mother. Harriet raised an eyebrow. About what? About my intentions toward her daughter, Frank replied seriously. I want to do this properly, Harriet. A rush of emotion, joy mingled with apprehension washed through her. Frank, we've only just… I know, he interrupted gently. I'm not proposing marriage tomorrow. But I am declaring my intentions. When this business with Mitchell is resolved, when I know I can offer you security and not just a struggling ranch. He trailed off, his meaning clear. Harriet leaned down from her saddle and kissed him once more, a promise in the gesture. I'll see you tomorrow, she said, then turned her horse toward town. The following weeks brought challenges and victories in equal measure. True to his word, Frank visited Vance the next day, hat in hand, to formally request permission to court her daughter. Eleanor, with a knowing smile, gave her blessing while extracting a promise that Harriet would not neglect her family obligations in her new romance. Mitchell made good on his threats to return, sending men to harass the Cooper Ranch at night, shooting at the house, stampeding cattle, even attempting to set fire to the barn. But each time, neighbors appeared to help defend what had become a symbol of resistance against Mitchell's expansion. The turning point came unexpectedly through Harriet's younger sister, Helen. While working at the general store in town, Helen overheard Mitchell discussing altered land deeds with a county clerk. She reported this to Harriet, who immediately recognized the significance. If Mitchell had been falsifying deeds, it would explain how he'd acquired so much land so quickly and provide leverage against him. Armed with this information, Frank and Harriet traveled to Cheyenne to meet with the territorial governor. The investigation that followed revealed extensive fraud not only in land acquisitions, but in bank loans and cattle sales. Within a month, Mitchell was facing charges that would eventually send him to prison, and his empire began to crumble. With Mitchell's threat neutralized and his fraudulent debts against Frank's property invalidated, the Cooper Ranch began to flourish once more. Frank used knowledge gleaned from Harriet about more efficient ranching methods to rebuild his herd and restore profitability to his operation. On a crisp October evening, as they sat on Frank's porch watching the sunset paint the newly harvested fields gold, Frank reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I've been carrying this for weeks," he confessed, turning it nervously in his hands, waiting for the right moment. Harriet's heart quickened as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small diamond. "It was my mother's," Frank explained. "Catherine had her own, but this one, I thought it might suit you." "It's beautiful," Harriet whispered, emotion tightening her throat. Frank took her hand, his expression solemn. "Harriet Vance, when you rode onto my ranch 6 months ago, I was a broken man living on borrowed time. You helped me rebuild not just my fences and my livelihood, but my belief that life could be worth living again." He slid from the porch bench to one knee before her. "You are my foundation in every way that matters. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred Harriet's vision as she nodded. "Yes," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Frank Cooper, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into an embrace that held all the promise of their shared future. As the last light faded from the sky, they remained on the porch, planning not just a wedding but a life one built on the sturdy foundation they had created together, one fence post at a time. Their wedding the following spring became a community celebration. The ranch, now restored to prosperity, hosted nearly every family in the county. Eleanor Vance, her health improved with reduced financial strain, beamed with pride as she watched her daughter marry a man who had found his way back from the brink of despair. Under the same cottonwood tree where Catherine and James were buried, Frank and Harriet exchanged vows. Frank had added a small bench beside the graves, acknowledging that the past would always be part of their story not as a shadow, but as a reminder of resilience. "I promise to be your partner in all things," Harriet said as they faced each other, hands joined. "To build with you, to stand with you, to create a home and a life that honors both where we've been and where we're going." "And I promise to never forget the gift you've given me," Frank replied, his voice steady and sure. "Not just your love, but your strength. You taught me that broken things can be mended, that foundations can be rebuilt stronger than before. I will spend my life making sure you never regret choosing this path with me." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, cheers erupted from the assembled guests. The celebration continued into the night, with dancing in the barn cleared for the occasion and tables groaning with food contributed by every family present. Near midnight, Frank led Harriet away from the festivities to a quiet corner of the property where a new fence gleamed white in the moonlight, not a cattle fence of posts and wire, but a picket fence enclosing a small plot of land adjacent to the family cemetery. "What's this?" Harriet asked, puzzled by the empty enclosure. Frank wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Room to grow," he murmured against her ear, "for our family when the time comes." Harriet turned in his embrace, her heart full to bursting. "Our foundation," she said softly, understanding the profound symbolism of the gesture. "And everything will build upon it," Frank agreed, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of promise, of healing, and of a future neither could have imagined when a stubborn young woman first arrived to help a broken cowboy rebuild his fence and with it, his life.